Chapter 3, Public Opinion. Let us admit that democracies are governed by public opinion. But how do we know public opinion? It is the aggregate of the views men hold regarding matters that affect or interest the community, says James Bryce, a rather indefinite description since opinions cannot be added together like algebraic quantities. Is it the opinion of the majority? A certain school of political writers object to calling it so, for that would give to public opinion something of an accidental nature. It would rob vox populi of its mystic authority, vox populi being in democratic theory the counterpart of monarchical divine right. In their efforts to save public opinion from the debasement of identification with mere majority opinion, the backers of vox populi sometimes make Pope of logic. Public opinion is not strictly the opinion of the numerical majority, it is said, and no form of its expression measures the mere majority, for individual views always to some extent are weighed as well as counted. When the opinion of a majority is referred to, it is not the numerical, but the effective majority that is meant. But to speak of an effective majority as distinguished from a numerical majority is merely to juggle with words. We may speak of an effective opinion, but majority is a numerical concept, and an effective majority which is not also a numerical majority can only mean a minority which somehow manages to rule. Obviously, until opinion is measured, that is counted, we are only guessing when we say public opinion is this or that. Each observer merely gives expression to his personal estimate. Usually, public opinion means just such a vague and unmeasured impression of prevalent opinion. Counting, that is voting, decides the matter for all. It is another question, however, whether the registration of opinion voices public opinion or makes it. For what exists before public opinion is registered? Only a multitude of confused dispositions, needs, instincts, vague and feeble reactions to a dimly conceived situation. These are not opinions. Opinions are decisions, choices between alternatives. On public matters, few men have opinions. Public opinion is rather the reverberation of an action. Those who have voted for a proposition are unalterably convinced of its correctness. The surest way to fasten an opinion upon a man is to get him to do something consistent with its acceptance. Many a man finds it less onerous to hand over $1 or to vote than to think his way clear through a problem. The report of the vote becomes public opinion. If left to itself, public opinion may grow by the slow secular process of trial and error, something like a social habit or folkway finally getting established. But public opinion is not left to itself, and today less than ever. Persuasion is part of the art of government. It is the business of leaders and statesmen to form public opinion, to direct the thought of a nation in predetermined ways. A good deal of what appears to be public opinion in a community is not opinion at all, but habit. A society cannot afford to expend energy in forming an opinion upon every point on which it is required to act. If certain types of opinion, or rather of conduct, were not habitual in a society, it would perish from excess of agitation in making up its mind. These types of conduct, like letting other people's property alone, are unconscious, for the same economical reason that personal habits like eating 3 meals a day, buying a morning paper, and shaving, concerning which one does not make up one's mind every day, are automatic. The marked apprehension that is felt in a community when a social habit is challenged and held up for review is due to the instinctive dislike of the members of the community to the painful work of forming a real opinion. People are born into certain types of opinion, Christians or Jews, monarchists or Republicans, bourgeois or proletarian. The number of those who work on the material in their heads and form opinions of their own is very small. The so-called opinions that one hears in conversation are well known to be duplicates of a few originals found in newspapers or in printed matters sent out by interested makers of opinion. There are 3 kinds of persons in every community: those who make opinion, those who accept opinion, and those who have no opinion at all. The makers of opinion are the politicians, journalists, writers, and thinking professional men. It is much the smallest class of the 3. The range of subjects upon which men are fitted to form original opinions is very narrow. Most men are obliged to accept the opinion of someone having prestige in politics, in religion, in science, in morals. This is unavoidable. since it is possible for the average man to be expert only in the small field of his regular occupation. He shows his judgment, his character, however, in the choice he makes of the leaders whom he follows. He is obliged to read the signs of trustworthiness, of genuine ability as distinguished from pretense in men. That the choice of experts, of leaders and authorities is one of the most important and critical of human preoccupations is everywhere apparent in conversation, which is mostly about persons, and whether you have heard so-and-so speak, and whether you have read so-and-so's book. The leaders that are followed are not always men who have first-hand information on the subjects on which they issue opinions, but those who are credited with special ability in choosing the real thinkers and experts. Clergymen, for example, announce their views on every literary, scientific, philosophical, dramatic, and political subject. Men who have one distinction as inventors, chemists, or automobile manufacturers pronounce verdicts on problems of education, biology, economics, and religion. They are listened to respectfully because they are supposed to know better than the average man on which side the truth is likely to be found. They are the trusted secondary authorities. It is no doubt true that one man who holds his belief tenaciously counts for as much as several men who hold theirs weakly. Yet it is well known that the intensity with which an opinion is held is in no wise proportional to its truth or to the depth of the mind that entertains it. The shallowest and the most ignorant are the most violent in their opinions. All we know of the intensity of an opinion is the fierceness with which it is expressed and the doggedness with which it is clung to. Qualities, not of opinions but of temperaments. Fierceness and tenacity go far in getting opinions accepted by others, partly because of the natural dislike of most men for controversy, partly owing to the presumption that an opinion sincerely and strongly held is more apt to be true than one indifferently defended. Leaders whose opinions crowds adopt are largely synthetic personalities. No sooner does a man aspire to become a leader than there begins the formation of a myth in the minds of the people, which becomes less and less like the actual person as time goes on. This is partly the work of a mythologizing instinct operating spontaneously in man. The work is skillfully aided, however, by the makers of opinion, the disciples, old guard or political henchmen who have enlisted under a certain banner using armies of publicity agents. Once the synthetic leader has come into existence, practical men and economic interests find it convenient to use him as a symbol or figurehead. The political boss, officially a private citizen but an actual master, has the symbol borne aloft and steered by invisible wires. Since mistakes are disastrous to prestige, leaders of opinion are careful not to be too far in advance of their followers. There is the danger of the rank and file refusing to follow. A leader must, of course, always seem to lead, but the surest way of having his ideas accepted is to know in advance what ideas are acceptable. The successful political leader, therefore, keeps his ear to the ground and is the first to give expression to views that are sure to be adopted. He must constantly keep in the limelight and not allow the idea of his leadership to fade for any length of time from the minds of his followers. It may be objected that there is a contradiction in saying that public opinion is formed by a few leaders, and again that leaders are forever watching to see which way the wind blows. The contradiction is only on the surface. Although the populace has no opinion, it has emotions, instincts, prejudices. An opinion that thwarts or frustrates these cannot prevail. It is for evidence of these emotions, instincts, and prejudices that the leader listens. And when the people seem to be ready to react to a definite suggestion, he leaps ahead, uttering his war cry and calling for his men to follow. With words we govern men, but the effectiveness of words is not in proportion to their significance in logical propositions. As Barrett Wendell taught the sophomores a generation ago, words have connotation as well as denotation. They have penumbras, clangs, echoes, associations, affective tones. "I am by calling a dealer in words," said Rudyard Kipling in a speech before the Royal College of Surgeons. And words are, of course, the most powerful drug used by mankind. Not only do words infect, egotize, narcotize, and paralyze, but they enter into and color the minutest cells of the brain very much as matter mixed with a stag's food at the zoo colors the growth of the animal's antlers. Joseph Conrad, like Kipling, felt the omnipotence of words. He who wants to persuade should put his trust not in the right argument, but in the right word. The power of sound has always been greater than the power of sense. Nothing humanly great I mean as affecting a whole mass of lives, has ever come from reflection. On the other hand, you cannot fail to see the power of mere words, such as glory, for instance, or duty. Shouted with perseverance, with ardor, with conviction, they have set whole nations in motion and upheaved the dry, hard rests of our whole social fabric. Give me these two, ground on which the right word and the right accent, and I will move the world. The name is everything. Concepts are fixed by names. A thing is what it is conceived to be. A name classifies a person, an object, or a thought, and it becomes difficult to think of him or it, except as a member of the designated class. In order to fix an object in a class, it is necessary only to name some prominent trait which is recognized as characteristic of the class. Imagination completes the picture. A good caricature often conveys a sharper impression of a man's character than a photograph. The father of his country, Old Hickory, Stonewall Jackson, will remain forever animated virtues. You mark as permanent objects of affection Teddy Roosevelt, Uncle Joe Cannon, Big Bill Edwards. A man speaks with a foreign accent, and whatever else he may be as an individual, he is first of all a foreigner. Nicknames are an ancient, offensive weapon. Few take the trouble to investigate the appropriateness of the labels that persistently cling to things that have the name-maker's condemnation. This is especially true of classes and nationalities of men. We see an everlasting fitness in jolly Irishman, phlegmatic Dutchman, subtle Chinaman, canny Scotchman, etc. We give attractive names to things we wish to promote and deterrent names to those we wish to destroy. Roosevelt called a certain type of journalist a muckraker, and the name did much to put the tribe out of business. It is a terrible thing today to be called a reactionary. The Bolshevists supplied the reactionaries of the world with the deadly weapon of their name. Walking delegate was not long ago a handicap to labor leaders. A certain type of politician in New York finds the interests extremely handy. Some of the ready-made categories under which men are frequently classified for the purpose of condemnation or blame owe their immense prestige to major trends in religion, philosophy, and science. Antisocial carries more vivid condemnation than impious. Unscientific carries more conviction than ungodly or irreligious. It is obvious, too, that a name derives its blasting or its transfiguring power from the affections, dislikes, fears, desires, hopes, and sentiments of those to whom it is addressed. If you speak about Jews, Catholics, or Negroes to an audience of Ku Kluxers, your words arouse waves of repulsion in the hearts of the listeners. To speak of the interests at a banker's convention would only excite merriment. In short, shibboleths get their explosive power from the complexes of the special audiences to whom they are addressed. Professions, trades, and classes have their specialized shibboleths. The language of political orators is full of one kind. Clergymen, scientists, philosophers, artists, businessmen, women and boys have their own kinds. I yield to no man in respect for the Chief Executive of the United States, but, said a governor of New York in a recent document. How familiar the cliché. It is thus a highly arbitrary proceeding on the part of Professor X to accept speculative evidence merely because it meets the needs of his theoretical structure, a well-known scientific specimen. Great pains have been taken to prove that opinions are not shaped solely by emotions or desires, but that is a position nobody takes. Emotions and desires have a powerful influence, but the evidence of the senses, authority, uncontradicted testimony, and other elements influence the formation of opinion. The passengers on a sinking ship are surely enough compelled by the evidence of their senses to believe that the ship is sinking, despite their wish to keep it afloat. But a palpable fact, which is not a matter of opinion at all, should not be confused with situations in which opinion is the nearest approximation to truth possible. Yet even in the case of the sinking ship, it will be found that if there is the slightest room for doubt, desire will play a part in determining opinion. The greater number will not give up until the evidence against them is overwhelming, and some will not be convinced that they are going down never to rise again until they strike the water. Even then, if they but float a few minutes, they will look around for something to cling to in the hope of ultimate rescue. It is often thought that the non-rational impulses which influence opinion, prejudices, emotions, desires, are baneful impurities which interfere with the formation of true opinions. They are, however, the things that lend drive to thought. Without them, we should not care enough about the problems before us to form any opinion whatsoever. William James wrote that if he wanted to pick an outright duffer for a scientific research, he would take a student who was impartial and unprejudiced. An emotional urge, even if it be only pride in a preformed opinion, is necessary to give the push to intellectual activity. The process of forming an opinion rationally is powerfully affected by the contagion of crowds. Except in rare instances, an individual does not feel sufficient confidence in his own opinion to pit it against that of a multitude. If he reasons at all, it is to the effect that the many are more apt to be right than the few. Generally, however, he simply hates to be left behind by the crowd. He wants to be on the right side, but even more, on the winning side. He wants above all to be a good fellow. Makers of opinion accordingly aim, as far as possible, to create crowd conditions. It should not be forgotten that crowds are not limited by locality. The same newspapers, the same bestsellers, the same editorials, speeches, and now the same radio talks and movies keep people over the whole United States in a state of crowd mind. The crowd mind is, briefly, one in which there is a diminished sense of personal responsibility for the correctness of one's thinking. Neither the origin nor the soundness of ideas are scrutinized. Each one feels that it is enough if the idea appears acceptable to the crowd. With the surrender of responsibility, there comes an intoxication, a feeling of irresistibility. To produce the crowd mind, manipulators must create a sense of contact, physical or mental, with a multitude obeying a common impulse. In order to arouse the feeling of such a common impulse, reactions are called forth from the crowd. Cheers, applause, parades, demonstrations, letters and interviews in the press, speeches, votes, petitions, all operated for the purpose of inciting to imitation. To produce conviction, that is opinion, it is essential to concentrate or limit the attention to the particular idea desired. Walter Bagehot stated the underlying principle correctly when he said that the primitive or primordial mind believes everything presented to it without contradiction. The most compendious possible formula, perhaps, would be that our belief and attention are the same fact, says William James. Every exciting thought in the natural man carries credence with it. To conceive with passion is eo ipso to affirm. Exciting thoughts crowd out all others. The application of this principle to an abnormal degree is seen in the practice of hypnotism, which is primarily an intense narrowing of the attention of the subject to the operator and his suggestions, all other impressions being pushed into the background. The hypnotist says that a clothespin is a dagger, and the subject sees a dagger. Outside of the clinic, two great civilizing institutions make use of the principle of the limitation of attention. They are the platform and the press. An orator who gets a crowd into a hall has one great advantage over his hearers. They must keep silent while he talks. If he is master of his art, they can think nothing but his thoughts. They must, for the time at least, believe them. Only exceptional persons can maintain the attitude of incredulity while passively listening in an assembly. If a considerable number in the audience are in sympathy with the orator, they cooperate by their murmurs, facial expression, and applause in carrying conviction to the rest, or at least in paralyzing independent thinking. The practice of heckling does not materially lessen the advantage of an orator, supported by partisans, and reserving the privilege of the last word. That this strategic superiority of the orator is not due to any degeneration in modern audiences is apparent when we recollect that in the palmiest days of democracy, in the city democracies of Greece, the same condition prevailed. No ruling assembly ever contained so many men who had intelligence to guide their wills, coupled with freedom to express their wills by a vote, as did that of Athens. But that will was the will rather of the crowd than each man's own, and was in the last resort due to the persuasive force of the few strenuous spirits who impressed their views on the mass. The grasp of an orator upon his listeners' powers of judgment is strikingly shown in the workings of the jury system. The average juryman is for the defendant while counsel for the defense is speaking. for the prosecution when the state's attorney speaks. If the verdict were rendered immediately upon the close of the pleas, its nature would depend upon which one of the orators had just concluded. The charge of the judge is interposed and is accepted by every fair-minded juryman as a welcome depolarizer. It enables him partly to resume a judicial attitude. The net result is that the great majority of cases are decided by the judge, who has the last word, whose voice is still in their ears as the jurymen begin to deliberate, and who speaks with the immense prestige of official and undisputed impartiality. Newspapers narrow attention by giving prominence to news that supports their policies and by printing inconspicuously everything that points to opposite conclusions. Antagonistic opinions are excluded. Newspapers have the great privilege of repetition and may say the same thing in slightly varied form, day after day, week after week. Most men read the same paper every day, become saturated unwittingly with its opinions, and view the world of politics, economics, and morals through the editorial lenses. There is another method of limiting attention. It is through the control of the practical machinery of registering opinion. By this is not meant ballot box stuffing or other strong-arm methods, but only the control of the mechanism for stating the alternatives from which a choice must be made. The public left to itself might go on milling about in a confused sort of way, distressed perhaps as individuals by the situation in which they find themselves, but with no common thought, nothing amounting to an opinion, no conception of anything to be done. Along comes a leader and advances a proposition, raises an issue. After that, the public can do nothing but decide yes or no on that proposition. No other business can be transacted until that question has been settled. The issue may be a false one, having little or no bearing upon the actual difficulty. Nevertheless, that is the sole question, officially and actually up for settlement. There may be several other formulations of the problem extant in the community. None of these get recognition. The political managers and bosses have put up the only alternatives that can be considered. The weakness or utter inability of a mass of men to plan an action is inherent in numbers as much as is their slowness in getting out of a theater with a single exit, or their inability to speak distinctly in unison. The attempt of each person is neutralized by the action of the others. It affords political bosses their capital opportunity. Gabriel Tardy, in his Laws of Imitation, makes limitation to two alternatives, a psychological condition of choice. In legislative assemblies, there are never more than two propositions in conflict at the same time, the affirmative and negative. A greater number of bills may be up for consideration, but there are never more than two in conflict at the same time in the hesitating mind of the lawmaker. Every decision is a duel between opposites, the elimination of irrelevant claims to attention being the first step in the formation of opinion. Hence, whatever political parties there may be in a country, for example, there are never more than two sides in relation to a question, the government and the opposition. The fusion of the heterogeneous parties, united on their negative side. Have you ever seen a battle take place between 3 or 4 parties? Never. There may be 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 armies of different nationalities, but there can be only 2 hostile camps. Just as in the council of war prior to a battle, there are never more than 2 opinions at the same time in relation to any plan of action. The one for it and the other made up of those united against it. The caucus, the nominating convention, and the steering committee are the technical devices of politicians for exploiting this situation. The splendid lead they have by virtue of their official position enables them to make slates and bring in bills. A conspicuous example of the use made of this advantage is familiar. The selection of candidates for the presidency of the United States through the operation of national conventions falls in practice into the hands of a small group of politicians. The nation is obliged to choose between 2 men few citizens would have selected. It often happens that a candidate nominated by a convention has scarcely been known outside of his own state, except by professional politicians and journalists. The peace conference at Versailles resolved itself into a council of 10. This again became the big 3 or 4, which wrote the treaty. The minor allies and the enemy had to take this or leave it. The art of controlling public opinion has in recent years made notable progress. Much of this is due to the expansion of psychological research having the definite aim of discovering the motives of conduct, the conditions that influence particular forms of behavior, and the means of controlling it. Some of the progress is due to the great improvement in the mechanical means of communication. The telegraph, telephone, express trains, mobile printing presses, cinematograph, and radio, which unites a vastly greater number than ever before into one mass or crowd. A large body is much more liable than a small one to this nervous conflagration, to this contagious intoxication of the emotions and judgment. For example, a numerous public meeting than a jury or a vestry, wrote Cornwall Lewis nearly a century ago. A new chapter of history shaped by the possession, on the part of the makers of public opinion, of definite, recognized, and tested principles underlying their art is gathering momentum. Benjamin Kidd, in one of his startling flashes of intuition, saw this plainly. It is clearly in evidence that the science of creating and transmitting public opinion under the influence of collective emotion is about to become the principal science of civilization, to the mastery of which all governments and all powerful interests will in future address themselves with every resource at their command. Chapter 4. Spellbinding. John Morley remarks somewhere that to the Greek mind, oratory was akin to the black arts. It was defined by their subtlest philosopher as the art of enchanting the soul by argument. Our own reference to it as spellbinding is always made with an ironical implication. Why not admit without humorous reservation that oratory is spellbinding? This business of controlling the behavior of others by the communication of thought is not restricted to the human species. The herd obeys the sentinel deer, and courier ants initiate tribal behavior of considerable complexity. But these have no personal ends to serve. It is otherwise with the human orator. His aim is not simply to communicate information, but to dominate and direct. The average man's conception of a parliament as a free intellectual arena, where everyone who feels the impulse may give expression to his thought, a tournament of ideas from which the wisest emerge triumphant, is very far from the truth. Experienced observers know that the speeches in a folk mote that are of any account are not spontaneous wellings of thought, but carefully planned moves to win the control of the meeting and to direct its action in a predetermined course. And it is the same outside as inside Parliament or Congress. It is one of the paradoxes of democracy that the art of enchanting the soul by argument flourishes best under the form of government that, theoretically, secures to every citizen perfect freedom of self-determination. In democracies, we meet with the greatest efforts to substitute for the self-determination of the citizens the determination of orators. The chiefs of democratic governments are orators, like Gladstone and Lloyd George, Gambetta and Clemenceau, Crispy and Luzzatti. The leaders of popular reform movements have been orators, like LaSalle, Babel, Danton, Jaurès, Gayday, Ramsay MacDonald, Bryan. Critical moments in the history of democratic nations have been made memorable by the greatest of all spellbinders: Demosthenes, Cicero, Pitt, Patrick Henry, Webster. For the enchanter of souls, the beginning of wisdom is a knowledge of soul nature, and not merely of the soul in general, but of the particular souls he aims to influence. But obviously, the amount of individual psychology the public orator can acquire is insignificant in proportion to the number of people he addresses. Nor would it be wise for him to greatly enlarge his knowledge, since he has but one speech to deliver and must frame his argument with a view to the character of his audience as a whole. When Patrick Henry, the ablest defender of criminals in Virginia, knew there were conscientious or religious men among the jury, he would most solemnly address himself to their sense of right and would adroitly bring in scriptural citations. If this handle were not offered, he would lay bare the sensibility of patriotism. These tactics enabled him on one occasion to save the life of a client who was guilty of deliberately shooting down a neighbor. By showing that the murdered man had once been under the suspicion of being a Tory and refusing supplies to a brigade of the American Army. The argument that will evoke enthusiasm from a mass meeting of labor unionists will have the opposite effect upon an assemblage of farmers. In general, as Aristotle remarks, old men and young, rich and poor, men and women, are moved by different feelings. At the outset of his speech, the orator confronts a many-headed monster. His first task is to make one out of the many, to unite the heterogeneous collection of listeners into a single audience. Here, some modern researches into mob psychology come to the assistance of the ancient and honorable art of spellbinding, which in its own way had evolved many excellent devices. In the first place, the assemblage must be made physically as compact as possible. The listeners must feel each other's bodily presence, touch elbows, hear one another breathe. A practiced orator does not tolerate stragglers in the remote seats of a partly filled auditorium. All must come down in front, leaving no visible gaps between them. Next, the auditors must do something together. Religious revivalists, with their congregational singing at the beginning of every service, have shown the way, and in stirring political campaigns, the revivalists' example has been enthusiastically followed. The tremendous part song played in the exciting campaigns of the 40s still lingers as a tradition and is attested by the numerous songbooks like The Clay Minstrel or National Songster, Log Cabin and Hard Cider Melodies, General Taylor's Old Rough and Ready Songster, and many others. The La Follette campaign managers tried to start a singing wave, but their candidate was unsingable. Applause is another more or less mechanical device that is helpful to the spellbinder, not so much as an expression of approval, but as a means of uniting the auditors. To this end, a clack is useful, although not indispensable. Every spellbinder worth his salt knows a number of cliches, patriotic or moral, that it would be disgraceful for a self-respecting citizen not to applaud. The funny stories at the opening of many speeches serve the same purpose. The important thing is not simply that the audience be put into a good humor, but that it be in a good humor about the same thing. The thought of a spellbinder enchanting his audience by argument suggests a gradual and progressive conquest, culminating in a final QED, before which the audience capitulates. The facts are just the reverse. The orator must win his audience at the beginning of his speech, for according to the favor of the audience, so is the success of the orator, says Demosthenes. His argument will seem sound if the audience is favorably inclined, but if he has not made a hostile audience friendly at the start, all his cleverness will only set them more firmly against him. The effects produced by orators cannot be ascribed to their ideas or reasonings, however sound these may be. The discourses of great orators, when printed, often make a poor showing by the side of the productions of orators of inferior reputation. "It was very curious," said a well-known and successful advocate. "I had all the law and all the evidence, but that fellow Hale, his opponent, somehow got so intimate with the jury that he won the case." In the popular imagination, a certain physical equipment plays a conspicuous part in the endowment of the orator, and we find this legend confirmed by the most eminent, authentic examples. Just as in the case of the mesmeric magician, so with the oratorical spellbinder, the magic is usually believed to reside in the eye. All the descriptions record the wonderful power of Pitt's eye in language that would be considered extravagant, says Frederick Harrison, were it not that its effect is vouched by so many persons. Pitt's eye, we are told, was that of a hawk. It was as significant as his words. There was a kind of fascination in his look when he eyed one askance. Nothing could withstand the force of that contagion. Webster awed and terrified juries. He commanded rather than persuaded, by sheer force of his personality. His eyes were extraordinary. The dull, black eyes under the precipice of brows, like dull anthracite furnaces, needing only to be blown. Patrick Henry's eyes were a dark gray, not large, but penetrating, deep set in his head, his eyelashes long and black, which with the color of his eyebrows made his eyes appear almost black. Gladstone had a flashing eye, an eye of remarkable depth. The expression of his face would be somber were it not for this striking eye, which has a remarkable fascination, writes John Morley. Along with the fascinating eye comes the clarion voice. Mirabeau, it was said, ruled with his larynx. He had the neck of a bull and a prodigious chest from which issued a voice of thunder. O'Connell's voice, says Disraeli, was the finest ever heard in Parliament. Distinct, deep, sonorous, flexible. A voice that covered the gamut, according to Wendell Phillips. Webster's voice was low and musical in conversation, in debate high and full, ringing out in moments of excitement like a clarion, and then sinking to deep notes with the solemn richness of organ tones. Pitt had a voice as well as an eye. Of him too, as of Mirabeau, it was said that he governed with his voice. His lowest whisper was distinctly heard. His middle tones were sweet and rich and beautifully varied. When he elevated his voice to its highest pitch, the house was completely filled with the volume of sound. That an oration is a species of chant was clearly recognized by the writers and rhetoricians of Greece and Rome. Aristotle and Cicero formulated metrical rules appropriate for oratory. When a speaker becomes oratorical, he becomes rhythmical. He sets out to weave a spell, just as truly as the primitive practitioner of charm and incantation. Mr. Everett Dean Martin, director of the Cooper Union Forum, where he had excellent opportunities for observation, remarks that when an audience becomes a crowd, the speaker's cadence becomes more marked, his voice more oracular, his gestures more emphatic. From this, it follows that, like lyrics in general, orations are subject to the limitations pointed out by Poe of being reasonably short. In most of them, the oratorical quality appears chiefly in the exordium and the peroration. The schoolboy who, not satisfied with the text of any of the standard orations in its entirety, formed for himself a composite speaking piece by joining together the conclusion of the reply to Heine with the peroration of "Give me liberty or give me death," and choice bits from Spartacus to the gladiators and Antony's address to the Romans, had the right feeling in this matter. A few long orations have attained fame for one reason or another. The effect of Burke's great speech on conciliation upon the members of Parliament was to drive them outdoors. Sheridan's speech at the trial of Warren Hastings lasted 4 days and was attended by society ladies as if it were a theatrical performance, but after a long trial, the defendant was acquitted. "A speech is a very fine thing," once said O'Connell, "but after all, the verdict is the thing." Rhythm, as all know, is hypnoidal. Listening to a song, one does not think of opposing considerations. There are elements of tone and pitch in oratorical rhythm for which no adequate description has yet been devised. Nevertheless, we know its presence. With some refinement of technique, it might be possible to identify orators like Pitt, Burke, Webster, Calhoun, Ingersoll, Gladstone, and Bryan from their rhythm. Incidentally, it becomes apparent that it is as impossible to really translate an oration from the language in which it was uttered as a lyric. How ridiculous would be Demosthenes thundering in the paralytic measures of his translator. "Don't reason with an audience," advises the psychologist. "Give them images, stir up their emotions. The more emotional a crowd is, the more suggestible it is." What then did Plato mean by enchanting the soul by argument? Is not reasoning futile? One thing seems certain: no amount of sound reasoning will of itself produce conviction. You may have perfectly sound reasoning leading to opposite conclusions. Take a typical example of political debate, that on the League of Nations. Are the reasoning processes of the two sides to this debate different? Do they disagree upon logical axioms? No, both sides reason in fundamentally the same way. Their intellects are similarly constituted. What they differ in is of another order. The orator may argue until he is black in the face that the League of Nations hands us over bound hand and foot to England. If I hate England, I will see nothing but death and dishonor in any sort of alliance with her. On the other hand, if I am animated by loyalty to Woodrow Wilson, no amount of imperfection in his league will turn me against it. Do those who are free from both these biases then escape the spellbinder's arts? There is no such easy way. After listening to orators on both sides of the question, the perfectly colorless, undetermined person will simply be unable to decide. Perhaps he will accept the advice he gets last, or he may espouse the cause he hears the more frequently reiterated, or he will vote as his friends vote, unless he is of a contrary disposition and does the opposite for its own sake. Or perhaps he will toss up a penny. While ostentatiously addressing your intellect, the orator actually appeals over your intellect's head to your instincts, complexes, prejudices, or interests. If you have none of these, you will be influenced by essentially irrelevant circumstances. Emotion is presumed to be completely drained out of arguments made before the higher courts, where custom demands that all oratorical embellishment be omitted. A lighter tone would be an impertinence, an implication that Supreme Court judges can be influenced by inferior motives like other men. And yet it is common knowledge that even the judges of the federal Supreme Court are divided into liberals and conservatives, certainly not a division upon purely logical grounds. Before a jury, the orator does not feel compelled to exercise the same reserve as before a bench of judges. Yet just as the mere reasoner gets no attention, so there is a conventional obligation to reason on the part of the man who makes an emotional appeal. Man is a reasoning animal in public. As long as he is alone, he may shut himself in with his inarticulate instincts. But when he tries to become social, he talks, he confesses. Custom and education have put the stamp of disapproval upon purely impulsive conduct, so that few audiences will listen to an undisguised attempt at incitement to passion. They insist upon at least the semblance of reason, upon some assurance of remaining within rational bounds. So we can always hear, even in the most violent appeals to the emotions, a major premise booming away like a concealed battery. One may venture the paradox that the function of argument in oratory is not to convince, but to make the orator credible. Sound reasoning adds to the spellbinder's prestige. It serves him like his hawk's eye, his clarion voice, and his commanding gestures. Since few men arrive at conviction by logical processes, the leaders who have the confidence of the many determine their opinions on those large matters that lie outside the range of their daily work and observation. Hard fact loses its identity when tossed between opposing spellbinders. It becomes difficult not to accept the version of a speaker possessed of abounding vitality, unimpeachable character, and an unassailable logic. The spellbinder, as Plato and Cicero pointed out, must be an expert practical psychologist. He must understand human nature, especially human emotion. The strings that work this puppet man, says Cicero, for who is ignorant that the highest power of an orator consists in exciting the minds of men to anger or to hatred or to grief, or in recalling them from these more violent emotions to gentleness and compassion, which power will never be able to effect its object by eloquence, except in him who has obtained a thorough insight into the nature of mankind and all the passions of humanity, and those causes by which our minds are either impelled or restrained. The emotions of men are linked up with certain basic instincts, such as love, fear, and combativeness. For the political orator's purpose, the greatest of these is combativeness. To Aeschines, said Demosthenes enviously of his accuser, is assigned the part that gives pleasure. For it is the natural disposition of man to take pleasure in invective and accusation. Men like a fight. A debate will draw a larger crowd than a lecture. A great deal of Chatham's oratory was, to use his own words, decisive indignation. The most interesting political campaigns in New York are those in which Tammany is ripped up. Many still remember the picturesque performances of W.T. Jerome when the crowds sought his meetings night after night as they ordinarily do the theaters. Even the evangelist Sunday owes the great attendance at his meetings in no small degree to the fact that he is regularly expected to abuse someone. Fear, not pugnacity, is the instinct usually relied upon in religious oratory. In this field, spellbinding is upon home ground. A Savonarola, a Whitefield, a Wesley, a Moody can produce effects that political orators may never hope to equal. Here it is legitimate to play upon the emotions to the uttermost. That the excitation of large congregations to religious ecstasy is done by spellbinding arts, which derive power from the laws of mob psychology, will hardly be questioned. Ask the individuals who have been swept along by one of these emotional whirlwinds what it was that influenced them. They will not be able to answer. They do not know. They were carried along by mob contagion. The converts who hit the trail under the excitement of the moment disappear from religious circles soon after the revivalist has finished his work. As we look over the human race, we observe gifted spellbinders diligently at work everywhere, laboring to mold the sentiments and direct the action of large bodies of their fellow men, not always by any means for their own advantage, but intent, nevertheless, to make their own conceptions and policies prevail. Out of pure love of men in religion, for personal profit in business, for power in politics. Always argument is employed, the presentation and interpretation of fact, the clarification of concepts. But the real reliance is upon awakening the subtle, subconscious motives of conduct, instincts, emotions, biases, prejudices, complexes, and upon letting loose the irresistible power of Mob. Crowd contagion. The secret magazines of explosive energy in the human soul are touched off by mere words, feeble breaths of air, which may start men upon trails of conquest or revolution, build up or destroy cities and empires, or transform the ways of living of millions. We have not yet fathomed the profound significance of the opening sentence of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, the greatest of all the engines of power.